Hello YouTube. So I'm here thinking again about the issue of politics, and I'm thinking about why it is that we suck so bad at thinking politically here in America specifically, but potentially globally as well. But really we should, I feel like I'm only qualified to talk about the sort of political mood in an American context. And I'd like to use as my reference point the question of climate change, because I think that this is intensely interesting. Not so much for the way this issue is debated within the realm of the media or even within the government, but rather the ways in which it's not debated, the actions that are not taken. Now I consider myself, I'll just be sort of upfront about my biases, I consider myself to be in solidarity with traditions of radical leftism, specifically variations of sort of democratic communism, council communism, anarchism, syndicalism, etc. And depending on what day of the week it is, you might find me closer or further away from any number of those positions. I find myself in this strange situation when researching. For instance, tonight I was reading about Antonio Gramsci, who writes a lot about how to organize political resistance. Right? He was a writer, an Italian communist who was sort of living through the rise of fascism, and is sort of pleading to his fellow party members that they have to give up their political purism and make alliances through shared interests across political divides. And this is something that we seem to really be bad at in America. And I don't really know why. I don't really know. I mean, I have some ideas, but I'm not sure that I've settled on any sort of position. If we look at the issue of climate change, this is an issue that would seem ripe for radical activity. It seems to be the kind of issue that stands to affect the most exploited among us, and most radically. It seems to be an issue that stands to affect everybody, quite honestly. And it seems to be an issue that a lot of people across a lot of different ideologies are interested in. So now, further, also, it's also an issue that I think our system, and by that I mean our political, our state, right? I use the word system in a lot of different ways, so I want to be clear. It seems to be an issue that the state and that capitalism as such has really dropped the ball on. And it doesn't look like there's any progress that's on the horizon, and yet people will sort of pay lip service to the idea. They'll get nervous about it. They'll talk about it occasionally, and they may even vote along the lines of somebody who is concerned with the issue of climate change. But it still is the case that the heads of, or some of the heads of the people, you know, responsible for making these kinds of decisions in the nation, or in the state, are active and avowed climate change deniers, right? And we as people kind of will watch videos by Bill Nye and go, yeah, climate change is real, you told that guy at Fox News. And that sort of satisfies us. And I guess the kind of question that I would raise is, why is the populace unwilling to undertake more radical action than that, right? Why is the populace unwilling to call for a general strike, for instance, to engage in much more direct forms of political action than I don't know, voting in the presidential election or something like that? It's interesting to me because, again, this is an issue that seems to be possible to unite many people and to cross ideological divides in a way that few other issues have the possibility of doing. If you look at the history of labor struggles in the United States, it's an interesting history, and it's instructive, I think, because the 8-hour workday, the right to unionize, etc., were not handed down by government officials, and they really weren't even acquired. Those rights weren't acquired or won through an activity like voting for representatives, right? Instead, the American populace organized repeatedly and had multiple real demonstrations, often ending violently, and we're really, really engaged in this issue at a level of direct action, right? And through those kinds of mechanisms, eventually, power, right? Eventually, state power was sort of forced to grant these rights. In fact, I can't really think of a political issue that was won in any other way. Maybe you could make the argument about that gay marriage was. I don't know. I'd have to think about it. Most of our liberties have, particularly around the question of workers' rights, have not been won peacefully. Whenever the public has sort of gone up against big business interests, and this might be a key distinction in the question of gay rights versus the question of the 8-hour workday, is the 8-hour workday was the American populace going up against the owners, right? Factory workers up against the owners. And the question of climate change strikes me as being the same kind of struggle, right? The reason that it's not really dealt with in the news, and the people who are most actively supporting the idea that it's not man-made and blah, 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 these are people who are representing big business interests. So that's what the American public has to go up against. And I don't think that kind of struggle has ever been won through the electoral process alone. Again, you need things like general strikes, you need things like organizations, right? Organizations of people that are engaged in political action that is, I don't mean to call for sort of violence, right? Such things can be non-violent, but you need political action that is not, that does not draw its legitimacy from the appeal to the process of the political process, the formal political process. Whenever these rights whenever rights, again, the people versus big business interests, whenever those rights have been won, they've been won by people organizing in such a way that it effectively threatens the social contract, such that those sorts of interests have to balk, have to give in, right? And it's not so much that I want to call for such a strategy, or it's not so much that I view myself as being in the position to organize those kinds of gestures. However, what I don't understand is why people don't make those kinds of gestures. Is that really something that's impossible for us to conceive of these days, to be engaged around what may be an existential threat, to be engaged in a really substantive political way, to threaten to shake up the norm? And then this turns into a really deep question about the nature of power and how it works in the country. What is it that prevents people from organizing in this way? Isn't it the case that whatever that is, whatever barricades are in place for people thinking this way, for engaging in the kinds of political struggles that I'm suggesting or talking about, isn't it the case that however those barricades work are an indication of how power keeps people in line in the country? And then at that point, does a contemplation of such a question not open up questions of resistance? In other words, how does power work such that it prevents us from thinking along more radical lines and organizing around more radical lines, even when we're faced with a potentially existential threat? The thing that prevents us from organizing in that way is an insight into how power works, and therefore how resistance should work. Maybe we just don't have a charismatic leader, right? Because it's not even the case anymore that the crisis is not isn't real. You know, there have been real issues that have been taking place that really affect people as a direct result of issues of climate change. And the centers of institutional power within the country, specifically the government and the centers of private power, capitalist institutions, all of those institutions seem to be effectively uninterested in doing anything substantive about such an issue. And so at that point, who do we appeal to? Well, we should appeal to popular power, because that's the way these issues have been in the past, and yet we don't. So that's some slightly rambly thoughts, but I'm just trying to think through the question of politics in a concrete way. Thank you for listening to my nonsense. Have a good night.